All right. Jamie, I'm going to come to you first because I feel like before we jump to an international lens, we might ground ourselves in the kind of Australian policy landscape and just talk about the different tiers of government and where the national title, native title conversations are at the moment. Do you want a scene set for us?
Yeah, thank you. And I'd just like to acknowledge country, that we're on Gadigal country today, and also acknowledge my esteemed colleagues here on the panel. The national context,
just that little question,
Yeah, just a little question. Something we're really deep in at the moment is heritage reform. We've been negotiating with the Commonwealth on national law reform since the Dukin incident 4 years ago in 2020. Something that we've been trying to drag the Commonwealth into, and also industry as well, I guess you could say, would be kind of a light way of putting it. And the kind of bookend of that is the most recent McPhillamys decision by Minister Plibersek only a couple of months ago, not far away from here in a little town called Orange, where we have a national heritage legislation at SIPA, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, which was introduced in 1984. Something that wasn't effective within the Dukin incident, and I guess the irony, for us was industry didn't come out and speak about law reform then, but now they're big on law reform because the decision went against them most recently. There's only been 13 decisions out of 620 decisions in the last 40 years since the introduction of the Act that have gone in favour of First Nations people, and this is one of them.
Wow. Can you just say those numbers one more time? Because I think that rolled off the tongue very quickly, but that's quite... I've not heard those numbers
620
before.
Decisions since the introduction of the Act in 1984.
Yep.
13 going in favour of First Nations groups. It's less than 2%. I think it's about 1.5%. And the most recent decision with the McPhillamys in a town called Orange, a couple of hundred k's from here, went in favour of the First Nations representative group, which put in an application, and that SIPA application 4 years ago. So I just heard the panel here talking about standards and getting those standards reaching at a minimum legislative standard, let alone industry standard. And we're working closely with the industry about what that looks like. But it has gave a bit of a heads up to industry, state, territory and Commonwealth governments that the legislative setting in Australia needs to shift, yeah? We've seen some industry groups that have actually post-Dukin, starting to kind of incrementally dig deep and increase their ability to kind of negotiate a better standard of practice. And I think you may have heard the panel over the last couple of days where some representatives from the PKKP, they speak about code management. So they have an agency actually in the facility on the site practice. And so you kind of bookend that with also, what's happening at a boardroom level, at an executive level, but also what's happening actually on the ground in negotiations and settlements, but also management of the site as well. It's something that kind of we're seeing a shift in the industry, but we're still pushing ahead with the law reform. So that's a bit of a kind of glimpse of kind of where things are at. We're getting close to some comprehensive law reform, which will hopefully be able to lift the standard to industry and give them some certainty and some clarity, but also particularly for the First Nations groups out there, give them the same perspective as well.
And Kia, from that macro setting that Jamie's painted for us there, can you take us to the situation Gelganyem are dealing with in Argyle? And just your perspective as someone that is, on the ground in community thinking about this particular challenge with First Nations groups.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and thank you, Jamie, for setting the scene because Gelganyem, so I'm a Gidja woman. My connection to the Argyle diamond mine is through the dreaming story there, Dowell or the Barramundi dreaming, handed down from my grandmother. And my parents met at Argyle, so there's lots of different connections. Argyle is interesting in the context of native title because native title does not yet exist, and there's been multiple examples of where agreement making served a certain purpose at a point in time. Gelganyem as an organisation is not a PBC or prescribed body corporate. We were created out of the Argyle Participation Agreement. The language I'll just try and break it down. So the participation agreement is essentially a contract that was entered into between traditional owners, not native title holders, so traditional owners who are 7 family groups, we call them Dam or Dawang, who have a connection. When Gelganyem was created, we were actually created as a trust to distribute funds and deliver programs, law and culture, looking after elders, essentially social, community and economic development. Our trust is made up of traditional owner directors, and we also have this funky role to hold Rio accountable through the role of an executive officer. So it's a really unique position to be in. And in closure, what that ultimately means is in the absence of native title, in the absence of a prescribed body corporate, then Gelganyem has been instructed and asked by our community of 7 family groups, 7 different nations, if you will, to actually advocate and ensure that the rights and interests of our families are actually upheld in line with standards that we feel are quite reasonable. What we've found in the tail end of the life of mine now in closure is, 1, there's no precedence. It's a steep learning curve for traditional owners. We're very lucky that we have now a really capable management team, but make no mistake that we are still a small Aboriginal organisation that is expected to respond to urgent priorities of a multinational billion-dollar company. And for us right now, we're acutely aware of, actually next month, we have a native title authorisation meeting. And there's a lot of sensitivity and time and energy that we need to turn our attention to, duty of care, which is not something that aligns with cost and schedule. And so the pressure that we've felt a lot in the last couple of years has really ramped up to the point where I think our relationship, those dynamics around power, control, are really starting to come to the forefront. So in the absence of native title that Jamie spoke about, it can be a really dangerous position for the regulator, for the company, for country, and certainly for First Nations people who don't have that certainty themselves.
Absolutely. Keir, I know when we were talking the other day, you said in the absence of native title, but equally post-closure, it's so friction-filled and it just feels very tense. And we'll come back in a moment to suggestions around different models, because Mark, I want to bring you into this conversation. One of the great benefits of having you here is we get the opportunity to explore a very different model. You are set up very differently in Canada, and it must be interesting hearing some of that Australian comparison, though I know you're familiar with aspects of it. In Canada, you've got a structure with the FNMPC that really allows you to support First Nations people differently. I want to just quote a stat. You're a First Nations-led non-profit that supports 175 First Nations members to negotiate better outcomes on major projects. So anything roughly north of 100 million Canadian. Can you speak to us about what you would call out as key distinctions between what you've heard Jamie and Kia talk to there between Canada and Australia, but also the journey or the insight that led to the creation of the collective?
So thank you. I am very honored to be here. I am speaking to you now from 2 positions. One, as the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, but also as an Intlaka'pamman First Nation in British Columbia near Vancouver, which we're 200 kilometers inland. And I am from a mining impact community. Our community was moved about 45 years ago to make way for Canada's largest open pit copper mine. The base of that pit is our old reserve, our old community. So I'm going to share on 2 perspectives here. But the coalition. The coalition is 175 nations who've come together to negotiate better environmental and economic outcomes for the projects. It started about 10 years ago when 11 First Nations in northern British Columbia, which is a province or state in Canada, had the opportunity, they negotiated a 30% equity option in a $5 billion natural gas pipeline. But in Canada, we as Indigenous people are wards of the Crown. So this, for example, is not mine as an Indigenous man. It belongs to the Crown. This is his king, the King's. He didn't need it today, so I've got it. But outside of that, imagine what happens when you go to a financial institution looking for capital and you have no assets. You have land, you have the native title, no assets. So the interest rates on the cost of the capital was about 30 to 35%. On a regular return of 9% won't work. Those nations thought this is going to happen again. We need an organization that can help us grapple with not only access to capital, but how do we organize ourselves to work on a linear project with 20, 30, 40 First Nations in a corporate structure, because we don't have corporate structures. So that was the beginning of the coalition. The mission was accessing affordable capital for equity options to invest. It's not a handout. But since then, 175 minus 11 nations have come forward. They all have something in critical minerals, electric generation, electric transmission, infrastructure that they want to participate in. And how do we find that capital? If a project is acceptable to the nation, and it's still the right of each nation to make that decision, and they want to participate, we as the coalition will provide the capacity for them to get to the table to negotiate a fair deal on environment and economics. We don't do the politics. So in the coalition, there's not enough of us to cover 175 nations. So we're supporting right now 18 projects, total capital expenditure of 48 billion Canadian. The best success we've had is a 50% equity option for new electric transmission lines being built in the province of Ontario, as well as a 10% equity option and a new natural gas pipeline across northern British Columbia. The other projects we're supporting include hydrogen, geothermal power, lithium play in northern Ontario, a supporting of a hydroelectric facility owned by the nations to provide power to a gold mine in northern British Columbia. And if you go to our website, FNMPC, you'll see all of those examples. We publish everything. Our members will come to us and ask us, there's a company here, it's come to speak to us. They say that they're a German manufacturer of cars, but we have never heard of them. Are they legitimate? And we will research them to find out. And in this case, they said it's BM something. They say they make cars. Is that a real company? It's like, yeah, it's a real company. Or right through to companies coming to us looking to find access to the traditional owners in an area. And I have learned this about Australia. Traditional owners don't always get along. We have that all the time. So the question then, companies and mining companies want to know, how do we proceed correctly? So the coalition itself has been successful in negotiating with the federal government to a loan guarantee program, which allows them to lower the cost of capital for boring on projects that will have a guaranteed revenue stream. That $5 billion tranche is the first one. There are provincial ones as well, but it's not enough. We have estimated that in the coalition, Canada will require, First Nations will require about $585 billion over the next decade if they're going to be into co-investment situations. So that's a lot. The coalition itself is still growing by about 2 nations per month as nations come on. The big push right now, critical minerals, clean energy. 85% of our projects that we support are in the clean energy space because they're easier to finance. You also know the cost of, not only, the revenue streams for the next 25, 30 years. There's a guaranteed offtake, it's regulated. Mining is tougher. Market-based pricing. Nobody knows what copper will be tomorrow, never mind next year, or lithium or nickel. But nations in Canada want to be parts of these, and we're trying to find creative ways to include them in the value stream of projects that they have deemed acceptable.
Thank you so much for giving that example. I think it's fascinating to hear about such a wildly divergent system to the one that we have here. To all the panelists, and the framing of this conversation is really around opening our minds to what a new future could look like. The idea we've mentioned in the title, things like co-ownership, design, shared prosperity. I'd love to come to each of you, Kia, and just ask you, what does a new future look like? What, as a conversation you would like to catalyse today with leaders in the mining and resources industry about things that we should be contemplating?
I might just focus in on our experience through closure because,
please,
Mark's given a great overview of equity. The reality for a lot of native title groups and First Nations people, traditional owners in this country, is we missed out on that. Just to kind of ground us in the history, the last referendum, not last year's referendum, 1967, we're talking about a very short period of time for true economic participation, let alone an equity model. So in closure, our view is that it's not the end of the life of that mine. It's actually the beginning of traditional owners being able to take back country that was shared. And our future is very much about our ability to return country to us and for us to return to country in a way that upholds our rights and interests, not just to meet a standard that is safe, stable, and non-polluting. And there's lots of discussions about grazing. You know, sure, back in the 70s when we were coming out of this cowboy era of pastoral movements, that was the most obvious because it was the one industry that our families, our old people were a part of. We got paid in flour and tea and sugar and tobacco, but it's not the same as what we're facing now. What we're facing now is hugely complex from a technical point of view. The level of risk and liability was not even discussed or put on the table. And probably to be fair to the industry and regulators, they also didn't understand. You know, that paints somewhat of a bleak picture. However, when we think about a new precedent for closure, we're based in WA. WA is often seen to be a government unto and a nation unto itself, setting its own rules. And Jamie spoke about legislation. We have a pretty firm view that until post-mining land use, the transfer of infrastructure, and the mitigation of risk and liability meets traditional owners' standards from a cultural, economic, social, and environmental perspective, then that mine cannot be closed, let alone relinquished. And to kind of make that real for people, it would be like me having a home, you saying you want to rent my home. This is an analogy that our CEO uses a lot. And then I come in as the renter and I decide that I'm going to take all the walls out. And then I trash the house, leave, don't pay rent, and then I expect you as the landlord to clean up the mess. I don't think anyone would like to have that situation. When you look at that from an intergenerational point of view, it can be quite confronting. So it's not lost on us that what is happening at Argyle is actually establishing and will establish a precedent. Our concern is that the precedent is not going to be high enough to satisfy First Nations people's expectations and society's expectations about protection of the environment for generations to come. Because I'm the generation that is now having to deal with that, and I'm a mum to two kids, and I absolutely don't want them to be worrying about the level of contamination. I want them to be able to fish, to swim, to connect, and be on country the way that our elders were. And right now, that's not possible.
That's a very significant challenge and equally a very powerful analogy that you painted for everyone here. Jamie, I'd love for you to add in, how do you see the future needing to look differently, and what are some of the solutions at the National Native Title Council that you are exploring with industry and government alike?
Yeah, I just like to lean on some of Mark's comments and the energy transition that Australia is currently in the middle of, and transmission lines, critical minerals, renewable energy projects, and the just transition to a renewable Australia. We know that the Commonwealth government, this government, currently has invested about $130 billion into the renewable transition, and we know that only a tiny percentage of that, not even close to 1%, have actually been invested in First Nations communities to actually be at the table in this energy transition. We're seeing that also from state and territory governments as well. We know that in the critical minerals process, it's been identified that probably about 60% of Australia's critical minerals will be found on First Nations lands. This is all First Nations lands, but land with actual titles, so native title and other titles. And we know that in the renewable projects transition, that the size of the land or the land mass that's going to be needed is around the size of the state of Victoria. So we know that land access is just going to go through the roof in the next, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Another point that Mark made is the point of access to capital. And they went through that, a decade or so ago. And we know that we're going through that right at the moment. So the fiscal relationship, not only within the corporate sector, the banking sector, the investment sector, has been, relatively non-existent in Australia for First Nations groups and having access to capital. So we're trying to kind of push the Commonwealth and governments, and Mark spoke about the loan guarantees, etc. That the federal government have actually came to the table of that in other jurisdictions. It happens also within New Zealand. To shift the fiscal relationship between First Nations groups and the Commonwealth government. So that's something that we're big on. And we're trying to make some inroads through the Prime Minister's office and also the Treasury Department, and hopefully we get some traction there. We've also produced a guide to business and also investors on, practice standards. So, it does set a kind of a benchmark, but of course we're always trying to kind of raise that industry standard as well. So something that we've heard from particularly investors are kind of what does good look like for First Nations community, and how do we know that the corporate sector that we're investing in, how do we know if they're doing the right thing from an ESG perspective and from a cultural perspective? So we've tried to give them some direction, particularly around, principles like FPIC, etc., and what it may approximate FPIC within Australia. And the best way to approximate is co-management, ownership of the actual project, and actually, be part of the actual project yourself rather than being a passive participant in a way and collecting a royalty payment, monthly, annually, etc. So that's kind of where we're at in Australia at the moment.
Mark, in many ways, in particular under the banner of this conversation, the Canadian example is further ahead and advanced on what we're talking about, and I think is useful food for thought here for us today. I'm interested for your thoughts around where you're challenging yourselves to go next. I know you've identified this sort of equity opportunity and equally the size of the capital that you're going to need. But I also want to bring you to something you said when we talked the other day, which I just think is interesting for us to explore, that is compelling about your model. And you said, in many ways we're getting investors asking the question, has this risk been mitigated? And the reason I'm bringing that up is for those who were here on day one for the plenary session, particularly hearing from the South Korean representatives from embassies and investors alike, there was an assessment done of Australia as a place to put money, and one of the identified concerns was just the uncertainty of native title and First Nations agreements, and the cause for concern around that there, I think is interesting to explore how your model has helped alleviate some of that concern from an investor side, as well as present an opportunity, a really unique opportunity from a First Nations standpoint. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
So there's several places to go. Uncertainty. We've heard the same thing in Canada. We've had foreign investors come in and say, you don't invest in Canada because you're never going to get past the native people, and the fact that they're going to protest everything. It'll take 25 years and you're never going to see a return. That has become an issue right to the federal government. So our Minister of Natural Resources has been taking Indigenous people to trade missions in Japan, in Europe, in the United States to say, look, speak to the native people directly. And our coalition, 175, that's about 30% of the nations in Canada, are of the position that we want to be co-owners, co-prosperity. Our perspective on this is that the purest form of consent is equity. You can never argue you have not given consent if you're an equity holder. You then get in a position where you have some say in how the project to be built, constructed, closed. Every situation is unique, though. So as we're going forward, that's the perspective we're taking at the coalition. And we have found, and we were quite aware of this, and you'll understand from how I'm speaking, we are ruthlessly market focused. And a lot of times, if we cannot get the federal government or the provincial government or the proponent to listen to our elders and our communities, what they want to do, we will not be afraid to go to the markets and explain to them, this could be stuck in a 25-year court battle. Are you prepared for that? When we were in the Japanese trade mission, we met Japanese saying, well, we want to invest in Canadian hydrogen projects, but we don't want to be in a 25-year court battle with Indigenous nations across the transportation corridors and at the source. So we invited them saying, come directly and meet the First Nations. And that's new, because what happened is they took us up on the offer, and we had Japanese business types showing up in remote bush communities asking those questions directly. That is a huge sign of respect from an Indigenous party, because now you're dealing with the proponent directly, not through 3 layers of the Indigenous Relations Department of the company, who is then interfacing with the regional state government, who has to then go to the federal government, who then might do something in the press. And while that's all happening, the council changes an election. So go direct. Realize, as actually you said, the risk mitigation. The job of every company is to mitigate the risk on their investment. And our elders have come to the point going, yeah, we are a risk, we know that, and if we help you mitigate it, that comes at a cost, a price, something. And we won't be extreme, well, I shouldn't say we won't, some nations will be, but not all will, in terms of what is available to the nation for mitigating that risk.
So this is obviously a much bigger conversation. What we hope today's conversation will do actually is catalyse many more, and will begin curiosity and questions at all the organisations represented here in the room today, as well as beyond. And I think while we've talked about technological innovation, process innovation, business model innovation, et cetera, over the last couple of days, what we're hearing really strongly, what I hope all of us leave hearing, is we need to equally be talking about the evolution of our model and our engagement. Before we go, I just want to give each of you a chance to give one final message to industry. What's something that you hope people leave today and take to leadership conversations, discussions with colleagues, et cetera, as they move beyond the room? Jamie, I might start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, like, if there's any industry, of course there will be, and investors in the room, certainty can be created on Australian soil. You just need to kind of deal with the First Nations groups effectively. And, organisations such as the National Native Title Council, other regional land bodies, etc., and actually dealing with the PBC can create that. So have the conversations, create the relationships, get the right advice, and, and maybe you can create, some equal and fair outcomes.
Great. Kia?
For me, I think it just builds on what Mark shared. We are not anti-development. There was trade in this country long before colonisation, and there will be trade here for as long as that's our system. So for me, it's about valuing what traditional owners and Indigenous people here and all over the world bring to the table. We want to be partners in every sense of the word. And sometimes that is hard for industry and regulators to understand, because partnerships sometimes are actually about power, and equity presents a challenge for people, because equity also provides a platform for First Nations groups that hasn't always been realised in Australia. So for me, in closure, for lots of groups who are looking at us, we want to be part of the way country is developed, but equally we want to be part of ensuring that future generations don't have to deal with the problems that are created by decisions made today. So it is about the protection of that, and we want to be part of that in a really meaningful way, not a tick-the-box kind of way.
Mark?
Think of this as that Indigenous people are no longer a domestic issue. We are part of global supply chains for the products at one end, the capital at the other. So we are now players in a global system. And what you're trying to do domestically in Canada and in Australia is to develop a project that sometimes gets lost in the nuances of thinking it's a domestic issue with this native group. It's not. It's a bigger question. And Indigenous people are now reaching out to organizations like us. The amount of calls I've had in Australia for the 4 days I'm here from Indigenous parties has been astounding, because they have read our material. They've seen as a way that we've had some success. So if you go to our website, First Nations Major Project Coalition, fnmpc.ca, you'll see all the materials I've talked about. You'll see what we as Indigenous people are talking about in everything from critical minerals, clean energy, transportation corridors, small modular reactors. Believe it or not, we're having a discussion among our members about nuclear power, or Indigenous nations who have interests in uranium mining, right through to hosting the waste facilities, right through to the operation of the plants. And we are now having American tribal groups coming to us with the same questions. So go to our website or find me on LinkedIn. I'll send you the information. But remember, you and us as Indigenous people are not alone in this. Somebody else has found a way through this. Look for those examples.
A crucial conversation. Can you join me in thanking so much Mark, Jamie and Kia for guiding us through it this morning? Thank you so much for being here at IMARC.